Welcome everyone. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the lands upon which we meet today, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and extend my respect to their elders past, present and emerging, and also extend my respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples here this evening. So I'm Jane Gunn, I'm Dean of the Faculty of Medicine, Dentistry and Health Sciences, and it's a delight to host the 8th annual Priscilla Kincaid-Smith Oration on Health tonight, and also to award the Sir William Upjohn Medal. So we've scheduled the oration to coincide with International Women's Day to celebrate women who are working in health and biomedical research, and to also honour the university's first woman professor, Priscilla Kincaid-Smith. I'm also delighted that following the oration, I will be able to present the Sir William Upjohn Medal to Professor Judith Whitworth, who was the inaugural Priscilla Kincaid-Smith Orator in 2015 and a protégé and close colleague of Priscilla Kincaid-Smith. So you will see the lovely synergy that we have here this evening. I'm also delighted that this evening the oration will be delivered by Ms Keran Howe, OAM, a lifelong advocate for women and people with disabilities. In recognition of Priscilla's pioneering work as a clinician scientist, we also like to use the Priscilla Kincaid-Smith Oration as an occasion to shine a spotlight on a woman clinician scientist, and to this end, I'm delighted that I'm joined by Associate Professor Ada Chung, who will introduce Keran Howe and lead the discussion with Keran after the oration. So I want to say a few words about Ada so that you all get to know about her work as well. Ada is a clinician scientist, an NH&MRC Fellow and a Dame Kate Campbell Fellow here at the university. She established and leads the university's Trans Health Research Group, which is aimed at improving the health and wellbeing of the trans, gender diverse and non-binary communities. And Ada really has been a trailblazer in this area. In 2021, she was awarded the Globe Community Award for LGBTIQ+ Ally of the Year. She's won a large number of international and national awards for her research, and last year she was recognised by her faculty colleagues with an award for excellence in engagement for her communication of science and guiding the inclusion of trans people in sport. So, Ada, you've been doing remarkable things, and it's a great delight to welcome you to the podium this evening. Please join with me in welcoming Ada.
Thank you very much, Jane, and welcome everybody. It's my absolute honour to be able to share with you the inspirational legacy of Professor Priscilla Kincaid-Smith and also introduce you to Miss Keran Howe. So Priscilla Kincaid-Smith was a clinician scientist. She was a trailblazer who transformed the field of nephrology. She achieved a remarkable career in the face of significant obstacles, including falling into medicine by chance. So Priscilla was born and raised in South Africa in 1926. At school, she was actually more interested in sport than in study and was a gifted athlete. She held national titles in freestyle swimming, toured Europe with the South African women's national hockey team, and only World War II stopped her from being an Olympian. She went to university in Johannesburg to study physical education, which fortuitously actually had a medical science component. And in her words, she says when she discovered medicine, she was hooked on it. Being a brilliant medical student and athlete, she tried for a Rhodes Scholarship, only to be told that as a woman, she was not eligible. Nonetheless, she moved to London in 1953, where she worked at Hammersmith Hospital, and over long hours in post-mortem rooms, an unlikely setting for romance, she met a young Australian doctor, Ken Fairley, and also developed her lifelong fascination with the kidney and its pathology. They married shortly after and set off for Australia. Having worked in the UK and in South Africa, the social attitudes and overt sexism in 1950s Australia was a huge shock for Priscilla. Married women at that time were prohibited from working in hospitals. There were no female professors. How far we've come. So she began a career in medical research at the Baker Heart Research Institute. In 1958, she identified a link between Beck's powders, a combined analgesic widely promoted for headaches, and kidney disease, and it was the most common cause of end-stage renal failure in Australia at the time. And following the failure of education campaigns, Professor Kincaid-Smith used her formidable advocacy skills to change legislation, removing compound analgesics from corner shops and supermarkets and put them behind the counter in pharmacies. The major cause of end-stage renal disease is now history. She authored over 400 research papers transforming global understanding of kidney disease in almost all areas, including hypertension, transplant medicine, glomerulonephritis, and renal disease in pregnancy. She was president of the International Society of Nephrology up to 1975, and she became the first woman appointed professor at the University of Melbourne in 1975. She was also the first female chair of the Royal Australasian College of Physicians, the first female chair of the Australian Medical Association, and the first female and first Australian chair of the World Medical Association. She would be a trailblazer in 2023, let alone 50 years ago. Most inspirational to me were the fact that her greatest passion was first her family. Ken, 3 children, and numerous dogs, horses, and cows on her farm in Apollo Bay. Her second passion was her patients. And despite being renowned as a scientist, she was an outstanding, astute clinician. She had wonderful powers of observation, and her research and advocacy were always patient-focused. This remains highly relevant today. We're always talking about co-creation in our research and our health advocacy. An abiding characteristic was her determination. If she thought something was important, she would go for it relentlessly and never take no for an answer. She lived according to her values, her strong sense of purpose and commitment to excellence in medicine and science, and she laid the groundwork for female clinicians and continues to be a role model and inspiration for many clinician scientists, including myself, as I face barriers to advocacy for gender equity for people of all genders. Whilst things have improved, we're still very much navigating similar issues with sexism in universities and hospitals, as Priscilla did in 2023. So this brings us to today. Professor Kincaid-Smith was a trailblazer, and our orator today is also a trailblazer, a change maker, and it's my pleasure to introduce Keran Howe. With a social work background and lived experience of disability, Keran is a passionate campaigner for the human rights of people with disabilities. She's represented issues related to women's health, violence prevention, and the rights of people with disabilities on a range of government committees, advisor councils, and boards, more than I could mention today. She's also a Churchill Fellow, where she studied hospital responses to women experiencing violence, and the results have contributed to the Royal Women's Hospital policy on screening for domestic violence. Keran was chair and later executive director of Women with Disabilities Australia, where she advocated to whoever would listen. She's currently member of the National Disability Research Partnership Working Party. Keran has been awarded a Centenary Medal, the Leslie Hall Lifetime Achievement Award, and the Order of Australia Medal for her work on behalf of people with disabilities, and has been inducted to the Victorian Honour Roll for Women as a change agent. Keran's address tonight is titled Adventures of a Disability Advocate, Learning Through Lived Experience, Practice, Policy and Research. It's now my great pleasure to invite Keran Howe to deliver the 2023 Priscilla Kincaid-Smith Oration on Health. Please join me in welcoming her.
Thanks so much, Ada. And thank you to the faculty and Jane for the opportunity to present tonight. It's a great honour to be here. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land that we're meeting on tonight, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and to pay respect to elders past, present and emerging, and any elders we may have with us tonight. It really is an honour to be here in honour of Priscilla Kincaid-Smith, And what an amazing woman she was, and how much she's influenced health policy, practice and research. She's done it all. And I guess as women of Australia, we all have a great debt to her of gratitude, not least because we don't have to take a mix and lie down and then get kidney disease. And on the eve of International Women's Day, I would also like to acknowledge my debt of gratitude to all of the women who have been trailblazing disability advocates. And I think of Tilly Aston and Elizabeth Hastings, Leslie Hall, Margaret Cooper, and more recently we lost Fiona Smith. And they're just a few. And being here tonight, I guess I'm reminded of Tilly Aston in particular, because Tilly, at the age of 16, was the first blind Australian to go to a university. Back in 1889, when she enrolled here in an arts degree at Melbourne Uni. But due to the lack of Braille textbooks and the resulting mental distress, Tilly had to leave. She couldn't continue and left in the second year. So she went on to form the Australian Association for the Advancement of the Blind, which is now Vision Australia. And she fought for greater independence, social change and new laws, including voting rights for people who are blind. And we have the seat of Aston in the news at the moment, and the seat of Aston is named after Tilly, if you didn't know. And I also want to acknowledge the many partners and collaborators who have assisted me in my work, activists, colleagues, friends and family. And some of you are here tonight, and I thank you most sincerely. Over the last 50 years of living with a disability, I've been privileged to have many different opportunities to receive an education, to have a career, to travel, to own a home, and to gain different perspectives on life, work, relationship, discrimination, collaboration, gender and disability. And I recognise that I'm really of a minority of people with disability who have had those opportunities. So I'm really delighted to be able to share my experiences with you. I grew up in the rural community of Deniliquin in southern New South Wales, and I opted for a nursing career. I was always interested in health, so nursing seemed like the right place for me. However, I didn't ever really seriously consider a university education, and in those days, of course, nursing was undertaken within hospitals like an apprenticeship. But I guess the idea of a university education came into my focus when I had a car accident, had a spinal cord injury, and my nursing career was pretty much finished just before it, pretty much not long after it began. So I chose to come to Melbourne Uni and studied humanities before undertaking a degree in social work. Melbourne was a very different university in the 70s. There were no disability liaison officers. There were very few accessible toilets, and a lot of the buildings were not accessible. So my friends would cart me up the old arts building stairs to the lectures that we wanted to attend there. Physical access has certainly improved, but I think universities overall still have a long way to go to meet their obligations under the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. And given the knowledge and expertise in this university, I wonder, it occurs to me that Melbourne could be a great exemplar in terms of upholding the rights of both students and staff with disabilities. Disabilities like vision impairment, hearing loss, neurodiversity and mental health. So what do we need to put in place to make this happen? This is a question that I think is still hanging with us after all these years. So after graduating my social work career, initially I started work at Urella Society in community development. And I was there in 1981, which was International Year of Disabled Persons. And I thought, pretty naively, that Australia was intent on coming to the table to, as its slogan said, break down the barriers. And I was part of a small committee who gained some IYDP funds to set up an interchange respite care service, which was the first one in Victoria, but now it's grown and it's wonderful to see how it's multiplied over the years. However, the year passed and we moved on to International Year of the Tree, and Australia moved on too in terms of its debate. So from Uralla, I worked in hospitals and community health centres, and I learned much from the people that I met in my work, including the destructive role that violence has on women's health and women's life opportunities. I learned that whilst it's really critical to focus on what the individual needs there and then, it's also incredibly important to look at what it is upstream that's causing the problem, and to look at the gender inequality that was emerging as the driver of violence. So this fueled my interest in how we could go about influencing services and government policy. So I joined boards and ministerial advisory committees on women's health and on violence response and prevention. And I worked with other women with disabilities to grow Women with Disabilities Australia and Women with Disabilities Victoria as advocacy organisations pushing gender and disability into the light. At the Royal Women's, I worked at the Royal Women's for 12 years, and my personal and professional experience there really heightened my understanding of how marginalised women there's so little understanding in a complex tertiary hospital of the social needs that marginalised women were experiencing. So I was involved in establishing, collaborating on setting up programs that were really geared to women's particular circumstances. And so we established the Local Links project at Broadmeadows, which was about providing an antenatal and social support service for Arabic and Turkish-speaking women. And I witnessed really misguided assumptions about women as parents with an intellectual disability. And despite the clear evidence to the contrary, the assumption that women with an intellectual disability would not be able to parent their babies. So this led me to advocate for the establishment of an antenatal clinic, Women's Individual Needs Clinic, which was set up to work particularly with women with intellectual disability. And it was a groundbreaking antenatal clinic in terms of the multidisciplinary approach to working with women with a range of cognitive disabilities. And whilst this clinic still exists and it's fantastic in its work, I think we still are dealing with the challenges of a child protection system that has quite unfair and biased assumptions about the capacity of women with intellectual disabilities to parent effectively, when what we actually need to put in place is support, the right kind of supports for women to parent. I also learned that research and an evidence base were the critical factors in persuading health professionals and government in developing innovative programs and policy reform. So we collaborated with the university here, with the School of Social Work, to research experiences of violence amongst pregnant women. And as Ada said, I was able to undertake a Churchill Fellowship and to go to the US and Canada to look at whether antenatal screening really was effective in responding to violence in pregnant women within hospitals. And then when Women with Disabilities Victoria finally acquired funding, I moved across to assist in its establishment as an independent organisation, and I spent the last 12 years of my working life there. And Tricia Maloney is here tonight, who is chair of Women with Disabilities Victoria when I was appointed as the executive director. So I guess the critical thing about Women with Disabilities Victoria was our model was that it was going to be by women with disabilities, for women with disabilities. It was going to have not only governance of women with disabilities, but the people who worked there would be women with disabilities. And that was a very effective and satisfying model. And we focused on highlighting the gender and disability disadvantage that women with disabilities experience. We created leadership resources and leadership opportunities for our members in both their local communities and at state and national level. And we emphasised disability pride and partnerships. We're a very small organisation, so partnerships were very important to us. And what was new and different about the research we undertook was that the research subject was chosen by women with disabilities. Women with disabilities were very much involved in the process all the way through. The funding was held by a disabled persons organisation, Women with Disabilities Victoria, and we chose partners whose research skills we could draw on from those sectors we wanted to influence. Our members were our essential contributors to that research, but also our family violence and disability service partners, and of course our academic research partners. And we were there able to document the issues facing women with disabilities who experience violence. And we know that this research really addressed a glaring gap in the evidence base, and it was enriched by all of the different perspectives that we brought to the table through that partnership. And as you can imagine, we had a lot of discussion about definitions and a lot of debate. So my journey over the years has really been paralleled by an evolving disability landscape, which I think has moved from real paternalism towards self-determination. 50 years ago, disability was very much seen as an individual problem, and services were run by charity organisations who raised funds in ways that were particularly demeaning for people with disability, for their clients. However, disability activists were championing the cause for human rights. Leslie Hall challenged the values of fundraising beauty quests like the Miss Australia quest that was held to raise funds for the Spastic Society, as it was then called. We talked about dismantling institutional care, which we now know poses great risks to its residents. And we continued talking about social barriers such as the lack of transport, housing, education, jobs, the built environment, as we still are today. So change has been glacial and really hard fought. 30 years ago, we saw the first Disability Discrimination Act. We were very excited to have a Disability Discrimination Act in Australia and a Disability Discrimination Commissioner. However, they were wonderful principles, but with a complaint-driven process that really disadvantaged the complainant and had no real teeth to prevent discrimination. Then in 2006, we saw the introduction of the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities after fierce campaigning from disability activists around the world, based on the voices and the aspirations of people with direct lived experience of disability. In the last 10 years, the growth of social media has given people with disabilities a platform and an opportunity for their direct voice. It's meant that they can challenge those stereotypes about passivity and incompetence. And it's really allowed people with disabilities to come into the spotlight, and we're now witnessing our greater visibility in the mainstream media and the arts, which is very exciting. And certainly the NDIS has been critical social reform, but nonetheless, I think consideration of disability overall is still embryonic in its development. Granted, today there is greater sophistication in the analysis of structural disadvantage and the huge power differentials that lace our society. We see more recognition that power still resides, as Ada pointed out, most substantially amongst heterosexual, white, non-disabled men. There's greater emphasis on advocacy. The concept of rights is better understood. Government consults more on what people with disability have to say, and services want to consult with their consumers. Nonetheless, advocacy continues to be very poorly funded despite the pressure of high demand for its services by individuals, community organisations and government. Today we are seeing a greater celebration of diversity, recognition that we all have layers of identity as people from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds, as First Nations Australians, as women, as LGBTIQA+ people, and people with disabilities. However, I think we are still generally talking in silos. We talk about race, or gender, or multiculturalism, or gay pride. But when we intersect these different characteristics, we see a cascade of disadvantage and marginalisation. Unfortunately, we're not seeing sufficient critical collaboration between the sectors that I think really need to work together. So we need to look more closely at these intersections. What are the issues for First Nations women with disabilities who live in rural areas or who are disabled refugees if they've managed to get in the country with a disability? For people with intellectual disability who live in supported accommodation and who identify as LGBTIQA+. So what is the situation for people with disability in 2023 in Australia? There is continued disadvantage in relation to employment, income, housing, transport, tourism, mental health, and with regard to bullying and other forms of discrimination and violence. Last year, the Centre of Research Excellence on Disability and Health here at Melbourne published stats on how people with disability are faring across multiple domains of life, and I thank Professor Anne Kavanagh for supplying these findings. The findings are shocking. There is much in the research that I could report, but time doesn't allow me to give you a full exploration of this. Just to provide a number of small examples. Labour force participation is 54% for people with disability compared to 84% for people who are non-disabled. A situation that hasn't changed for 2 decades. This situation sets young people up for a path of entrenched disadvantage across their lifespan. Disabled people experience physical, sexual, intimate partner violence and bullying and harassment at 2.5 times non-disabled people. Intimate partner violence was reported more frequently by people with disability, with some groups being at extremely high risk. Half of women with cognitive and psychosocial disabilities reported intimate partner violence in their lifetime. Half. It's therefore inconceivable to me that the NDIA, the agency that's responsible for the NDIS, has no clear practice guidelines or even a definition of domestic and family violence to guide workers' responses to their participants. Institutionalisation continues, particularly for people with intellectual disability. Often they have no other option but to live in a group home with up to 5 other people that they've not chosen to live with, and as we know, group homes are not safe for their residents. There have been 7,000 reportable incidents of group homes to the NDIS Quality and Safeguards Commission in the last 3 years. 85% of these related to serious injury, abuse, neglect or unlawful physical contact with a disabled person. That's 85% of 7,000. Many of these incidents occurred between residents in the home. Why then do we continue to look at shared accommodation models when we do have other models for disability housing? At the same time, we've had a long battle, I can think of it over the last 25 years, to introduce universal design into housing standards, minimal livable housing standards. And we're now finally seeing something being adopted across most states. But if we'd have achieved this even 10 years ago, think of all the housing and all the apartments in Melbourne that would now be accessible for people with disability. Quite simply, we can't improve health outcomes without addressing social inequity across the community. And this requires efforts across all dimensions: culture, media, academia, business, government, law, health and human services. Sir Michael Marmot's foundational work has clearly demonstrated the significance of the social model of health, how disempowerment and poverty actually affect our physical health, and how the determinants of health reside in our social systems, not in the individual. He's moved the gaze from individual pathology to the systems that dehumanise and disadvantage us. The impact of power differentials and the importance of power empowerment must therefore be governing principles in how we approach healthcare and research across all areas of society. Technical capabilities, of course, are important, but not more important than the skill to listen deeply and respect different perspectives and lived experience. And we all have the power and obligation to focus on the systemic causes as well as to treat the individual. In research, I think we must challenge the values that continue to constrain people with disability. The prevailing attitudes of our ethics committees in Australia is one of protectionism, not participation in research. Ethics committees have tended to focus on protecting people with cognitive disability, protection from being exploited. But what this actually means, it translates to not being able to be paid for your contribution, not being permitted to be employed in the work, and not even being asked your opinion about the issues that affect you if you have a cognitive disability. It leads to a lack of research and innovative solution that could transform the lives of some of society's most marginalised citizens. So for research to be effective, I think it needs to be undertaken in partnership with people with disability from the outset, to explore the best way to approach the questions that people with disability want answered. The advocate's job is not to keep retelling the same story that's been told repeatedly in our submissions and reports. Our job is to work with others to rewrite that story, to transform the systems that affect our lives. So we have a way to go in recognising the place of people with disabilities as co-researchers and as people keen to have academic careers that in turn will build the capacity of research institutions. There are many impressive researchers with disabilities, but we need to create incentives to grow this cohort. We need that lived experience across all faculties and all areas of knowledge if we are to advance innovation. Translation is also important. It's an important part of this partnership. We need to share knowledge to open our research findings to everyone. Why aren't we releasing knowledge from our journals to make it useful for advocates and people with disability more broadly who need to know it? We need partnerships between researchers and advocacy organisations to translate evidence into policy reform. Because advocates have a key role in holding that evidence and constantly keeping the issues before Parliament until it brings about change. And we need partnerships that recognise and value different perspectives and knowledge. My experience in working across violence prevention and the violence prevention sector and the disability sector taught me the great value of sharing our expertise and paradigms even when they seem quite opposed. We can all get on our high horse about our knowledge very easily. But when we start talking across those paradigms, it's mind-opening. The result is that the domestic and family violence labour force has a deeper understanding of the different forms of violence that affect people with disability. And the disability labour force hopefully has a greater understanding of gender stereotypes and power differentials as drivers of violence. We need to value all forms of knowledge and different approaches to collecting evidence. We need more collaboration across sectors and across faculties, more counting of people with disability in population-based research so we can identify particular populations' needs. For example, my non-weight bearing over the last 50 years has resulted in significant osteoporosis. What does the research tell me about managing my osteoporosis? Nothing. Because no work's been done on this on the non-weight bearing cohort. Finally, we need to have leaders with disability everywhere. As we hear constantly, you can't be what you can't see. We are seeing more profiles of disabled commentators, thankfully. Kurt Fernley, Dylan Thomas, Charles Grimes, Graham Innes, fabulous men. But what do we notice about these names? Yep, Anglo men. Great men, but as I said, it's glacial speed. We also have Australian leaders like Mary-Ann Diamond, who led the World Blind Union's successful and long, hard-fought campaign to achieve the World Intellectual Property Treaty. And that allowed the production of books in an accessible format for people who are blind, visually impaired or print disabled without permission from publishers. Tilly would be so pleased. We have so much more that must change to ensure people with disability are in on the ground floor of the information revolution and so many facets of society. You and me and everyone here has a role to play if we can get change happening. So let's take our inspiration from Priscilla Kincaid-Smith and all of the women advocates who have gone before. And above all, I say again, to achieve this, we must value and privilege the voice of lived experience. Thank you, and happy International Women's Day.
Thank you so much, Keran. And there were so many valuable messages in your oration, the importance of co-creation and valuing lived experience and making sure that people with lived experience are at the centre of everything we do. And clearly you've made a lot of change in your career and there's a long way to go.
Yeah.
So and you've talked about the importance of education and access in your life. How can we ensure that people with disabilities have access to quality healthcare and education and jobs and opportunity? And what are some concrete steps that we can take to promote accessibility and equal opportunity?
Thanks, Ada. Yeah, that's a big question. Well, I think as I've said, that really it's starting with talking to people with a disability, and there are many, many advocacy organisations that can engage around a whole range of those issues. And so it's really about ensuring that you are seeking out and finding people to work with as partners. And I think the important part of that, as I've said, advocacy organisations are extremely underfunded, are constantly being asked to do something. So the challenge is really ensuring that you can resource those people that you want the expertise from. And so I think
Pay them for their time.
Pay them for their time, precisely. Here at the university, I know that you have a disability reference group and you have students who are working on ensuring better access around the university. So starting with who's here, what can they tell us? How do we support them to support us? And how do we build that partnership? I think small steps, but great things can come from small steps. And it's really, I think always it comes back to political will and genuine motivation to see change. We have such a complex world these days. There's so much to take care of. There's so much to respond to. And so it's easy for people who are disadvantaged, who have less power, who are going to have less impact if they're ignored, maybe, to be overseen. And so we have to work incredibly hard, I think, to put people who are disadvantaged at the core, because in doing that, you create a better society for everybody. And so that whole concept of intersectionality and not just thinking about someone in a one-dimensional way is really important, because we are so many different things.
Absolutely. You actually talked a lot about intersectionality and the shared challenges of people who are marginalised, whether that be racially, people's Indigenous status, their sexuality, gender diversity. How do you think we can work together?
Yeah.
So there's a lot of people working in different sort of marginalised groups, and how can we sort of join together to improve visibility?
Yeah, well, I've been fortunate to have experienced that happening. I chaired a working group that was around ensuring a diversity lens and intersectionality lens on the implementation of the recommendations from the Victorian Royal Commission on Family Violence. And it was a fantastic group, and it had a cast, as you can imagine, of quite a lot. I think there were about 20 of us, and it ranged across all of the different aspects of diversity in our community. But it was a fantastic working group. There was immense energy, enthusiasm, respect. It wasn't a driving, this is my agenda, hop out of my way. Everybody was very respectful of working together, and what we found was there was so much common ground. There was so much where, you know, what was going to be responsive for one group was going to be effective for everybody. And so that group was able to look at the implementation policies, the policies that were coming through around implementing the recommendations, and to comment on them as they were in progress. And it was fabulous, and it brought about significant improvement in the practices that were coming through.
Fantastic. And how do you think we can ensure decision makers like government and policy are listening to, you know, these groups who are doing such rich work?
Yeah, well, again, I think that partnership and bringing people together around the table and having a variety of perspectives around the table. And so we're not just talking about one kind of knowledge and one kind of expertise. We're talking about bringing a whole, like here we're talking particularly in academia about research or the evidence that's being collected. But often advocacy organisations who want to make a change in policy reform don't know who's out there who's doing the work. Where are the researchers who might be able to partner, and how do we get together? So it's finding ways to bring the different players together and getting on the same page. So it's a shared effort. And it's very hard to argue when you bring all of that different perspective together.
Yep.
Around the common ground.
Yeah, fantastic. Now I'd like to invite Jane Gunn to come and present the Upjohn Medal.
Thanks, Keran and Ada, for what was a really stimulating oration. Again, sparks so many opportunities for us, challenges, and it's great to see the conversation that I think could have gone on for a very long time. So there will be some refreshments afterwards where you can continue to have those discussions. But it's now my pleasure to present the Sir William Upjohn Medal. And this medal is a very special medal for us at the University of Melbourne. It really looks at building on the legacy of Sir William Upjohn. And for those of you who don't know much about Sir William, he was a very distinguished doctor, academic, Chancellor, Vice-Chancellor of the University, worked across Royal Melbourne Hospital, the Royal Children's Hospital, and was known as a very compassionate man. I was fortunate enough to know one of his offspring, and who was also, I think, a very compassionate person as well. And so the medal has been put together by a contribution from colleagues of his in the 1970s. There was a portrait made of Sir William and also some medals struck. And the medals were struck in fact, you look at the difference in medals from what we give now to what we thought at the time, back in the 1970s, a large investment in these medals. And I think that this one this evening, Judith, might be the final one of the first medals cast. So we'll have to dip into the funds and make some more. But it's a very interesting medal to have a look at. Firstly, how small it is, but how special it is. And so it'll be, after I've said a few words about you, I'll have great pleasure in awarding that. We give the medal and we form a panel to assess the various nominations for the medal, and we had a series of nominations, and we've been looking forward to giving this medal throughout the pandemic. We award it about once every 5 years, and it's taken a little bit of time to get to this evening to have this honour. But we're looking for a person that demonstrates a broad and deep contribution to medicine, that has shown leadership at a national level, that work aligns with the faculty's values of collaboration, teamwork, compassion, respect, integrity and accountability, somebody who demonstrates advocacy for others, that have used their influence for the betterment of society, that have made an impact at a system level and have done all of that while mentoring others. It's a big ask, but we had great delight in assessing the various nominations for this awarding of the medal, and I was delighted that we were able to award the medal to Professor Judith Ann Whitworth, AC. So Judith is a trailblazer, another trailblazer, who we're very fortunate to count among our colleagues. She's had a remarkable career in clinical medicine, and this really spans the spectrum from basic all the way through to clinical research. She's shown great academic leadership. Her work has really featured around hypertension and high blood pressure, to use the lay term, and she really has made significant contributions to that work with more than 500 scientific publications. And you can read a little bit about her work in the little brochure that you have here this evening. Judith undertook her training at the University of Melbourne. She worked at Royal Melbourne Hospital. She undertook a PhD at the Howard Florey Institute. Of course, we're in a new version of that right now upstairs. And she studied the mechanism of glucocorticoid-induced hypertension, and I'm sure has made a significant impact as a nephrologist, but also both here in Royal Melbourne, but also in the University of New South Wales at St George Hospital. She's been Chief Medical Officer for Australia, and really Judith has been known for transforming the role of Chief Medical Officer into what you see as the modern day role. And we saw throughout the pandemic the important role that the Chief Medical Officer for Australia played. And I'm sure that just in the same way that we were able to bring vaccines to people so quickly, the way that we were able to respond to the pandemic so quickly from a policy perspective, from a government perspective, really would have had the foundations laid in what Judith did to transform that position when you were Chief Medical Officer. Judith, I'm not sure if you would agree with me. You probably won't because you're very humble, but others have said that is what you have put in place. You also were appointed, you were a director of the John Curtin School of Medical Research at ANU, and you really transformed that to be a really stellar research unit, known for its productivity and competitiveness. You have honours, many of them, including 3 honorary doctorates. You've also played very significant leadership roles for the National Health and Medical Research Council and for the World Health Organisation. You've been an invited professor so many times, you've probably lost count. We counted it at 20, and I'm sure it's probably even more than that. And of course, you're a companion in the Order of Australia, and you have many other awards and honours. I know that's not what drives you, and you're probably feeling very uncomfortable even with me saying all of this, but it has been your uncompromising support of excellence, integrity, mentorship, and a focus on making a contribution to society that makes me delighted to invite you here to the stage this evening to receive the Sir William Upjohn Medal.
Thanks very much, Dean, and thank you to the faculty and the university for this honour. It's a particular pleasure for me that the medal is named for Sir William because he had close associations with the Royal Melbourne Hospital. He promoted women in medicine, and he worked in overseeing the care and prevention of poliomyelitis in Victoria, all of which are very dear to my heart. To the Kincaid-Smith orator, Keran Howe, congratulations, you did Priscilla proud. Priscilla, like you, was a mover and shaker and an inspiration to people around her, just as you are. And I'm sure Priscilla would have been mightily impressed by your many achievements, as are all of us here tonight. When I was a little kid, I got poliomyelitis, and for a few years I was in a full body splint, and subsequently I had a whole series of operations so I could walk again. And I think it's clear that polio shaped my life. I was exposed very early on to medicine and to hospitals and to doctors, and there wasn't much else I could do, so I read stories about women scientists like Marie Curie and about disabled heroes like Douglas Bader, and closer to home, I Can Jump Puddles by Alan Marshall. And there's no question for me that that was the formative event in my life. Polio changed my life, whether it was for better or for worse, I guess we'll never know, but it certainly made my life different. And to Keran, I'd say, vive la différence. Thank you.
Congratulations, Judith, and congratulations, Keran. I wanted to thank everyone here for making the time to come and listen to our Priscilla Kincaid-Smith oration. It's so wonderful to have face-to-face orations once again. So please join us in some refreshments outside the theatre, and thank you very much for coming today.